Okay, if we can get seated. Good morning. So good morning, and welcome to the 39th Annual Baird English Symposium. Thank you. As we continue to battle this pandemic, we're grateful that we can return to our tradition of hosting an author in person, keeping alive a tradition that began almost 40 years ago, when longtime English teacher and department chair Warren Baird brought in the first symposium author, E.L. Doctorow, in 1984. The program has hosted greats like Arthur Miller and Gwendolyn Brooks, and as many of you may remember in recent years, Colson Whitehead, Sarah Ruhle, and Minjin Lee. And today we are so very excited to welcome Tracy K. Smith as this year's symposium author. Though many schools bring in writers to speak to students for an hour at an assembly, no other school has a program quite like ours, conceived by Mr. Baird as a culminating celebration of teaching and learning, as well as reading and writing. As I read Miss Smith's memoir, Ordinary Light, a particular passage struck me, because in many ways I think it really captures the spirit of the Baird Symposium program. She recalls coming across an Emily Dickinson poem in 5th grade. I think a number of you in the audience might be familiar with this poem. It goes like this. I'm nobody. Who are you? Are you nobody too? Then there's a pair of us. Don't tell, they'd banish us, you know. How dreary to be somebody. How public, like a frog, to tell one's name the livelong June to an admiring bog. Miss Smith describes how quick she was to memorize this poem, whose meter had worked upon her so quickly and in a way she didn't quite understand, noting a kind of mischievous collusion she felt with the speaker of the poem. She goes on to say, I like the sense of privacy the poem seemed to urge, as if there's some part of everyone, like the imagination, the spirit, or whatever it is that gravitates toward the language of poetry, worth protecting from the world. It made me feel special, privy to magic, as if whoever was speaking had sought me out, discerning an affinity. I think that when Warren Baird created the symposium program back in 1984, he wanted to foster just this kind of magic, just this kind of affinity for young readers and writers. And over the years, the symposium that bears his name has brought in so many authors who have sparked students' joy, curiosity, outrage, contemplation, and identification. Miss Smith found a similar kind of kinship in Emily Dickinson and also Mark Twain. And in her memoir, she explains, like them, I wanted to be able to say things that were moving and funny and true. Things so original that they might even keep on being said and being heard. And I think it's safe to say that Miss Smith has succeeded. She's pulled many of you into her inspirational orbit, fostering what J.D. Salinger refers to in The Catcher in the Rye as the beautiful reciprocal arrangement of reading and writing, learning, and teaching. Mrs. Fry and the symposium classes have surely been inspired and inspiring last semester, in their engagement with her work and with the rest of the community. In spite of the pandemic, they've brought Miss Smith's words to life in so many ways around campus. From the fall play, Poems That Wander, Moving with Tracy K. Smith, to the various Smithy projects students have immersed themselves in. Hopefully many of you have seen the gallery work that's still out there. Inspired by Smith, or listened to Stella and Amrita's podcast, or perused Emma's blog, or seen Kylise and Regina's interactive collaborative poems around campus. The symposium students also fanned out to English classes, which many of you know, engaging us in discussions about sci-fi and space, Bowie and Otis, love and loss, injustice and unrest, metaphors and meaning. Her spirit has been on campus all year, and we're so lucky to finally welcome her in person. But before I turn the assembly over to Ms. Smith, I'd like to invite Ashley and Stella up to introduce her. Thank you.
This is why I love poems. They invite me to sit down and listen to a voice speaking thoughtfully and passionately about what it feels like to be alive. Tracy K. Smith writes these words in her introduction to her book of selected poems, American Journal, 50 Poems for Our Time. Preceding the start of the school year, these words, perhaps the first words of Tracy K. Smith anyone in the 2022 Symposium class had read, is where we began our journey of exploring and relishing in the works of Mrs. Smith.
Born to Kathleen and Floyd Smith on April 16, 1972, in Falmouth, Massachusetts, Smith is the youngest of 5 siblings. She was raised in Fairfield, California, something you can learn all about if you read her memoir, received her BA in 1994 from Harvard, her MFA in 1997 from Columbia, and received the prestigious Stegner Fellowship, in which she continued to develop her creative writing at Stanford University from 1997 to 1999. Since our school year began, symposiates have witnessed the joys of Miss Smith's poetic interpretation of what it feels like to be alive. She leaves nothing behind. We worked chronologically through her works, beginning the year with The Body's Question, published in 2003, and winner of the Cave Canman Prize for the best first book of poetry by an African-American poet. Whether symposiates were discussing her Gospels, A Hunger So Honed, What Fear Is, or Dominion Over the Beasts of Earth, we were encouraged to dive even deeper into the human experience, looking at life through new eyes.
After The Body's Question, we segued into her second book of poetry, Duende, winner of the James Laughlin Award and Essence Literary Award. While reading and researching Smith's book of poetry, Duende, we learned that duende has a double meaning. 1, an imp in Spanish folklore, and 2, a rugged yet elegant quality of inspiration and passion. Smith's work definitely brings the latter. Duende is exactly what Smith brought to our class discussions. From why did she choose this topic, to does this one word at the end of this stanza have a double meaning, to how do the people around us shape who we are? Smith brought an explainable passion and inspiration to our class. After reading so much of her poetry, we were excited to see more of the world through Smith's eyes, this time in prose. In her memoir, Ordinary Light, a finalist for the National Book Award in Nonfiction, Smith unveils it all. Shame, joy, embarrassment, love, and reflection all sum up the literary experience that is Ordinary Light. What stuck out to me the most was how beautifully Smith detailed the relationships in her life, especially the unbreakable mother-daughter relationship, her faith in God, and her relationship with herself and her Blackness. All of these relationships and experiences helped make Smith into the woman she is today, and we got to read all about it.
Following her memoir, we then took a deep dive into life on Mars. Personally, I actually think that reading her memoir really helped me, really gave me new insight when reading her poetry. My symposium class actually spent extra time on this Pulitzer Prize-winning book. We went on lots of tangents, Googling what is a nebula, and spending ample time analyzing the phrase misbegotten turd. But we also considered how David Bowie's legacy and Smith's lexicon expanded our understanding of the ever-expanding universe. We cherished our time with this collection and admired the beauty and vastness of these poems. They may love all he has chosen and hate all he has rejected, Solstice and Ransom to name a few. We found ourselves bowing before the oracle eye, hungry for what it would find. In Life on Mars, Smith encourages us to think existentially about our perception of the world around us, and admire both the big and small with equal gusto.
The class then shifted to her fourth book of poetry, Wade in the Water. On top of the Smithian style and skills that our class had become experts at finding, this book of poetry also included a variety of stories and experiences about African American history and current events. From repurposing letters to Abraham Lincoln from former slaves or those still confined to slavery during Civil War times, to writing Unrest in Baton Rouge about the empowering photo by Jonathan Bachman detailing racial profiling and police brutality at the Baton Rouge protests in 2016. Smith circles both past and present realities for life of Black Americans and people of color.
Many of these poems were so striking and real, vivid and elegant. Our class would read them slowly, our eyes scanning the page as the magnitude of these poems sunk in. On the other hand, this book also drew us close with poems like Urban Youth and 4 1/2, where we caught intimate glimpses into the precious everyday moments. It was a beautiful collection, and one I'm sure we will all return to over the years.
I'm sure you all remember the summer of 2020. COVID was running rampant, and the Black Lives Matter movement was in full force. The country as a whole, and Black people especially, were healing from the murder of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, as well as looking quite seriously at our country's ties with systemic racism. Smith's poems in the riot section of her new book, Such Color, examine these portions of our lives intensely. With beauty and craft, Smith details what so many of us were thinking and feeling during quarantine. As she said in her eponymous poem, Riot, this is not the riot. This is reality. It rolls, roils, briefly recoils. It hammers down. We fall, rebound. You chase, we race. You hate, we wait. Mrs. Smith is a woman who has an eye and ear for poetry. From her books of poetry to her compiled collection of poems, American Journal, to the poems of Yile she's selected and translated in My Name Will Grow Wide Like a Tree. She's a storyteller, an activist, an opera librettist, podcast host, commencement speaker, essayist, an excellent listener, and human. It has been a pleasure to learn and grow and shine throughout this semester.
An artist and well-versed,
A poet laureate,
a master of her craft.
please join us in welcoming Kingswood, Oxford's 39th Baird Symposium author, Mrs. Tracy K. Smith.
Oh my goodness. Thank you. I can honestly say that is the most amazing introduction I've ever been given anywhere in all my life as a writer. I'm just so grateful for your two voices in stereo and in harmony with one another, and just the generosity with which you guys gave yourselves over to reading and thinking about my work. That means more than I can say. Thank you. And you have such a wonderful teacher to bring you on this journey in such a thoughtful and creative way. So I'm beyond grateful and moved and impressed to be here with all of you. Thank you. I thought I would maybe start with a poem that, learning that Gwendolyn Brooks read at this school is so exciting to me. And maybe the riot sequence in Such Color is definitely a poem that is leaning on and asking Brooks for guidance, and I'll read that this evening. But there's a poem that quietly, to me, speaks of her influence. I feel that she walks through some of the phrases and the nature of thought in a shorter poem called Mothership, and so maybe I'll start with that. And the little preface to this poem is that in 2020, as so many people were losing loved ones to COVID, to violence, to other things, my dear friend, the poet Camila Aisha Moon, who we actually lost this past year in 2021, she lost her mother to illness. And I was sitting in my yard trying to find the air, the quiet and the peace to just keep going through just a difficult moment, a long moment in our collective life, and thinking about Aisha's mother and my mother out there together somewhere, and that gave me a little glimmer of peace and joy. And then I thought, wow, if my mother and my friend's mother meet in the afterlife, what if there's a place where all mothers go and meet one another? And sometimes it's easy, and other times it's probably not so easy to face and listen to one another. And that is what gave me the urge to start writing a poem, which is called Mothership. You cannot see the mothership in space, it and she being made of the same thing. All our mothers hover there in the ceaseless blue-black, watching it ripple and dim to the prized pale blue in which we spin, we who are black and you too. Our mothers know each other there fully and finally. They see what some here see and call anomaly, the way the sight of me might set off a shiver in another mother's son, a deadly silent digging in, a stolid refusal to budge, the viral urge to stake out what on solid ground is authority, and sometimes also territory. Our mothers, knowing better, call it folly. I have written poems to try and listen better to myself and the many perplexing or powerful feelings that I live with. We talked a little bit in the workshop session about how poems do that, how they bring surprising or even counterintuitive language to the things that we feel and experience so that we can see them better and understand them from another vantage point. But I also found that I needed a little bit of courage to start writing more and more honestly about myself. And one way that I gained that courage was to imagine the lives of other people, people that I knew, people that I read about, people I observed. And so maybe I'll read a few poems from really across my career that are doing that thing of looking out. And I now know that what I'm looking for, and I think what any poet might be looking for in considering another person, is something about their own life and their own experience that they can give new words to, that they can reflect upon from a different distance. So this is, maybe I'll read two excerpts from a sequence in The Body's Question called Gospel, which is a poem about immigration. Gospel, Luis. The river we crossed to get here is a wide, black, furious serpent that swells with laughter when you step close. At its tail, in a snarl of branches where the rocks come up high enough and land stalls the current, that's where they say you'll find bundles of money and, more than anything, bodies of horses and boys like us. I remember how deep the dark got. Nothing we could do but wait. Even the sound of my own voice in my head echoed, got lost in the sound of what roamed. Eyes lit like sparks a house gives off when it burns. I tried to dream of what animal would shine like that from far away. Gospel, Juan. We crossed the border hours before dawn through a hole dug under a fence. We crossed dressed as soldiers, faces painted mud green. The coyotes that promised we'd make it gave us a straw broom to drag behind, erasing our tracks. They gave us meat, drugged for the dogs. Farther off, there were engines, voices, a light that swept the ground. We crossed on our bellies. I wonder if we'll ever stand up. And this is a poem from Duende called After Persephone, looking to a mythical figure helped me to kind of speak out from what was the aftermath of a marriage that ended for me, to claim a different kind of agency in relation to that experience. After Persephone. At a certain point, it didn't matter. I commanded him to lead farther. So far, I was no longer me, long before I was no longer safe. I shed everything save being. There is a moment, even in the face of defeat, when the chase alone is enough. I lived quickly, my whole life disappearing from around me like a sound that rises into the air and is gone without even an echo. After song, there is a pang, the heart in clench. Then memory, then retreat into the present, that silence, not emptiness, but weight. I felt my steps marking the space where I must tread. Then it was I who led, dragging us both into his world. It was real, more real even than what came after. I want to move a few, maybe 30 pages forward in this book to a more recent poem, a sequence that's also concerned with the lives of other people, people from history, but what the poem is really set into motion by is a concern that I have for us in the present, in the history that we are contributing to in this country. Looking backward in time and trying to listen differently and to different sources sometimes helps me gather a new vocabulary for naming, what we live with, which is scary sometimes. It's violence, it's a distance between some people and others that is man-made, unnecessary, and yet seemingly impermeable, conflict. In this country, a lot of that has to do with sources of difference, class, gender, geography, beliefs, and race in America is a big source of difference across which a lot has happened. A lot has been damaged. So I'll tell you a little bit about this poem, which is called The Greatest Personal Privation. I was doing research for a project on the history of the Sea Islands, coastal Georgia, South Carolina, places like Hilton Head or Sapelo. And there's a really powerful, epic history of the Jones family, the Charles Colcock Jones family, called Dwelling Place, which is written by a historian named Erskine Clark. And I got to meet Erskine Clark and travel with him and his wife to this region. And there's a series of letters that the Jones family wrote to one another about a family that they held as slaves. And at first they said things like, well, here's a line. The greatest personal privation I have ever had to endure has been the want of either Patience or Phoebe. Tell them I am never, if life is spared us, to be without both of them again. And so, this written by Mary Jones to her cousin while she was away from home, away from these women that were enslaved by her family, recovering from an illness, and she felt longing and the wish to be back, reunited with these women. And then other letters in which Jones and her family members are trying to figure out what to do with Patience and Phoebe and other members of their family who had started to rebel against their enslavement and run away from time to time or misrepresent themselves in other parts of the community. And so the family decided they would sell the family that they owned as slaves, disband the family. And I thought, this happened countless times to countless people. We know this. I wish there were letters from Patience and Phoebe that were, part of this historical record, but far too often there are not. And so what I set out to do in writing this poem was to listen within or between the lines of the letters that the Jones family wrote back and forth for traces of these other voices, kind of like listening against the grain to imagine what Patience and Phoebe and their kin felt. And so this is what I gleaned, through erasure, the greatest personal privation. I imagine that these women are speaking to one another. It is a painful and harassing business belonging to her. We have had trouble enough, have no comfort or confidence in them, and they appear unhappy themselves, no doubt from the trouble they have occasioned. They could dispose of the whole family without consulting us, father, mother, every good cook, washer, and seamstress subject to sale. I believe good shall be glad if we may have hope of the loss of trouble. I remain in glad conscience, at peace with God and the world. I have prayed for those people many, many, very many times. Much as I should miss Mother, I have had trouble enough and wish no more to be only waiting to be sent home in peace with God. In every probability, we may yet discover the whole country will not come back from the sale of parent and child. So far as I can see, the loss is great and increasing. I know they have desired we should not know what was for our own good, but we cannot be all the cause of all that has been done. We wish to act. We may yet, but we have to learn what their character and moral conduct will present. We have it in contemplation to wait and see. If good, we shall be glad. If evil, then we must meet evil as best we can. Father, mother, son, daughter, man. And if that family is sold, please, we cannot, please, we have got to, please, the children, mother and father and husband and all of you, all, I have no more. How soon and unexpectedly cut off, many, many, very many times. I know we're going to have a conversation, so I want to save time for that. Maybe I will just read one more poem. Okay, I'll read this one. The wave after wave is one wave never tiring. I was saying last night at dinner, Teddy was talking about this poem and pointing to the images of water that run through the poem. And then he got to the bottom of the poem and he talked about trees. And in my mind, whenever I read this poem, sometimes I'm up at the podium thinking, why did I shift my context? Why am I suddenly out of water and in trees? And was that like a weird mistake that I made in this poem? And then he gave me a new confidence by saying the trees through the roots are in constant conversation with the water. And so I felt like vindicated in a way. So thank you. I don't know where you're seated. The wave after wave is one wave, never tiring. Light atop the water, the form in the water, the after image of water, standing, falling, risen over and again. Freedom is labor, to labor at oneself, to keep what is earned, to disappear, reemerge, plunging and carried, lightness and burden. The smallest waves shingle in, are tugged back to surge, to rise, to be swallowed and remain. They are the wet in the sand, spreading in and down, dark center of the old stain. The wave after wave is one wave, never tiring. Freedom is fearsome. A nut drops onto fallen leaves, and my heart leaps. What approaches through this ringing in the trees? And what warning does it carry from the sea? thank you so much for listening. Thanks. Thank you. So I know we're meant to have a Q&A, so I'm very eager to hear what questions you might have. Okay. The question is, when I write poetry, how do I get started? Do I write from inspiration, or do I have a list of ideas? How do I get started? And I guess the answer is all of those things, depending on when. When I feel very lucky, which is not most of the time, I have a lot of ideas coming to me, a lot of questions in my mind that sort of project themselves onto what I'm looking at, what I'm learning about, and somehow all of these new terms and images and events speak to what I'm thinking about, and poems flow naturally from that. Other times, I want or wish to write a poem, or have been asked to write a poem sometimes, like today, I'm supposed to write a poem for something. And it's harder, because I may not have that feeling of an idea that's waiting to kind of get into language. And those are the times when I have to stop and listen, when I have to dig a little deep, when I have to sometimes turn to a received form, like a pantoum or a villanelle or hustle, to try and help coax me forward. Because a form, it's like a roadmap, and there are certain things you have to do. And there's even a certain path, because of things like rhyme or repetition, that your thoughts must follow. And sometimes that makes it easy to get started. But I also sometimes have notebooks that have little things like a poem about, X, Y, or Z, or a title, or something I've seen. And those things often make their way into the poems that I end up writing, but sometimes it takes a long time. But I know how much help it is to me to go inward and to be attentive in the way that poetry requires. And so I'm always trying to pull myself back to that place when I can. Thanks for asking that. Oh, wow. What was the very last thing you said? The toxic use? Oh, okay. So the question is about a poem called Solstice. It has an image of geese. And so the question is, was I thinking about those geese as like an extension of people who might be conforming to patterns and thoughts and ideas and following blindly? I wasn't thinking about that circumstance, but I think it might live really easily in a poem like Solstice, which is a villanelle, so it's written with a certain pattern of repetition that makes it easy to talk about cycles of things. And in that poem, there's a cycle of the news feed that comes up again and again. There's the cycle of, when print publications get a little bit smaller, every few years it's about like budget cuts and, like dwindling subscriptions. And so it's always, to me, a little bit sad. And the other feature of that poem is geese that were, years ago, like in 2009, I remember hearing a bunch of news stories about how geese were being euthanized in New York City because they were flying in the airspace over JFK, getting caught in the engines of airplanes and causing them to have to land. Or, you remember Sully landing on the Hudson River. That was, I think, because of a goose. So I was thinking about literal geese, But that poem is also a poem of lament about the age, the time that we're living in, where there are things like election fraud and people maybe not thinking as clearly or independently as, we imagine we used to. So I think that concern is adjacent to the poem, but the geese are real. I felt bad for the geese that were being killed. Yeah.
How do you stay confident in your work?
That's a good question. How do you stay confident in your work in the face of criticism? Criticism can hurt a little bit, even like snarky comments people make online, or and I try to listen to as little of that kind of feedback as I can, and trust certain voices, perspectives. When you respect someone or something, it's a little easier to take criticism and to say, oh, maybe they're right, maybe I'm wrong in this respect and can learn, as opposed to the comments section in an article where the intention is maybe a little bit mean-spirited. So that's part of the life of any writer. And you ideally develop a little bit of resilience and a little bit of willingness to let go of your ego. That's probably the bigger part of the answer I'm interested in offering. It's very easy to say, I have the format of a poem, a stage of a poem, and I can present a very perfect image of myself and my world, the effect of my presence in the world, if I choose to, a kind of aggrandizing, a lens. But there's this other thing that you can do, which is to be a little removed from the wishes and the needs of your ego and say, I'm small in the face of this material, which is big. I know I'm wrong in some ways. I buy things from places that are destroying the atmosphere, and every single choice I make has repercussions, and I don't always think about all of them. I like to imagine that the wish that brings me to the page to write is more rooted in that desire to be honest and to be sort of vulnerable in the poem. And I think that's one way of dealing with the very same ego that wants praise. Praise is great, but it's not in the same way that criticism is subjective and not always to be trusted. Praise is the same way. And so finding a way to make this life of writing into something that is not rooted in praise and ego aggrandizement, but submission to what you think is important, I think that's I've found that to be a healthy direction to think, to the extent that it's possible.
Yeah, sorry, I just wrote that out in case I forgot. So this question might be very personal because I'm thinking to become a writer in future, but I'm still not sure about my career because I also got other interests as a young person. So I want to ask, what are the advices you want to give to the younger generations who have like interest of being a writer but still kind of uncertain?
Yeah, what's the advice I would give to somebody who thinks they might want to be a writer, but who has other interests and who isn't quite certain? I think that's a great piggyback on the last question. If writing is something that you like doing because of the praise that it brings you, maybe it's a risky endeavor to put, your future on. If you can find peace in the notion that writing enriches your life, heals your unrest, even if it's not going to be celebrated and given big prizes and make you a lot of money, maybe that's a good indication that you're suited to the very unpredictable life of a writer, from poem to poem or book to book. But I also understand, like for me, writing was it. That's what I wanted to do. I didn't want to listen to my parents when they said, go to law school or think about another safe career, as they understood it. But I know lots of people do it differently. I have friends who are lawyers and poets, or doctors and poets, or people who work in other areas because they love the work that they do and they love the effect that it has on other people. And poetry is something that adds to that. I have so many students now who are not majoring in English, but for whom poetry is a way of life, because it's this tool for reckoning with and looking more closely at all kinds of things, including the course of study that they've chosen, which might be something like computer science or philosophy. And so I guess I would say you don't have to decide once and for all. You certainly don't have to decide right now. And even if you choose a path that doesn't seem like it's that of a writer, that doesn't close down the possibility of writing as well. Mm-hmm. Other questions? Oh, sorry. I was looking at you, Isaias, and then the other voice that I heard, but I didn't see who's speaking. So we'll do 2 questions. And you can ask them back to back. How's that? Okay, so when do I consider a poem finished and ready to submit? And then can we hear the other question as well, and I'll try and answer them both. Can you maybe stand up and ask it again? I heard part of it, like how do I translate feelings into words, but I didn't get all the beginning. Okay, I think I can make a connection between those 2 questions, because figuring out how to translate feelings into language is, what I'm trying to do in making a poem. And there's a moment when I don't think it's right or finished, and there's a moment when I do. And so that would mark the moment when I think I'm willing to share it. But the other part takes longer. First, I write, and I let the immediacy of whatever makes me want to write. It might not be hot emotion, but a deep interest in something that brought with it powerful feelings. I let that lead me onto the page, and maybe there's a phrase or an image that comes from that I can trust, that I like the sound of, that feels less obvious than the kind of thing I would say like on a phone call. And so I'll begin from there. And I'll move forward by listening to what I've said, looking around within, the space or the imaginative space that those words make to see if there are things I can see and describe, to see if there's rhythm or music beginning to take shape, maybe through the momentum of sentences or maybe through internal rhyme. And I use those things, I move forward based on those principles. So maybe I'll make more sounds that allow that music to be furthered. Or I will, if there's an image that exists as a metaphor in one place in a poem, maybe I'll work with it as though it's real and actual later in the poem. And then more questions come up and more ideas come up based on that. And the poem has a life force. And I know that a poem is getting close to ending when I start to see and recognize things or even conceive of them in a way that I wasn't able to do at the beginning. When something new within this familiar thing begins to reveal itself, and then I get very excited. So I revise poems for a long time. I go back to that first or second or third draft, and I'm looking for areas where I'm being lazy with language, where I'm being indulgent, or where I'm doing things I always do, and where I should push myself to do things differently. And so I'll revise. I also like formal symmetry, so I'll see what I can do to make the poem kind of symmetrical in some ways in terms of line or stanza length. And then when I feel like it's done, I'll decide if I want to share it. I don't publish poems instantly, almost never, although the poems in the Riot section, I did publish many of them in the same summer in which I wrote them. but oftentimes I'll wait and gather and collect poems and understand what they're saying to one another, what they would say in a book, before I'll send the individual poems out. So I have a pretty powerful and trusting dialogue with my editor, whose name is Jeff Schatz at Grey Wolf, and with a couple of other poets who are old friends, like Jericho Brown and Tina Chang. Those are like two, the people I send my manuscript to. And then eventually the poems I feel safe giving them to the world. And I hold on to them longer now because I've published things and later regretted them, felt like they weren't done, and I don't like that feeling. Other questions? Yeah.
So, in poetry, there's a lot of examples of like metaphors or similes that are like often reused and like kind of become like predictable and stereotypical. So, how do you avoid falling into that trap of like predictable imagery?
Mm-hmm. If I find myself wanting to say something that is like a cliche, I will say, what if I take 2 or 3 steps beyond the familiar? So could you give me an example of like a familiar phrase that we use? For some reason, standing here, I can't think of one. Okay, don't judge a book by its cover. And then I'll think, well, I can't say that in a poem because that is like the most familiar phrase out there. And so then I'll think, well, how can I deconstruct this thing? Can I move a few steps beyond cover, take a step down the path away from cover, or even change the noun of book to something else? And then when I start doing that, my mind is, kind of a little bit more active, and either it runs away from the cliche and leads me to a different, fresher place within the same general image system, or it just runs away altogether and I get a new idea. But it's important to say that everybody thinks of stuff that you've heard 1,000 times before. Sometimes I just put brackets in my poem and know that I'll come back with a better solution, but I don't want to be derailed by that momentary struggle. I think that we don't give ourselves time often enough to move past the obvious. And it's not just familiar phrases, it's the first thought. It's the way we always or have been like trained to see things. And in the rush of our day-to-day lives, we don't have the opportunity to stop and put pressure on that, which is why writing feels so important, because it allows us to say, I know I say this all the time, I know everybody around me is saying this, but I think we could do better. What is the better thing we can say? How can this language help me to think more courageously? And then some of that stays with you, and it's what comes to mind instead of judging a book by its cover, Okay, all the way in there.
So, as a poet laureate, what would you say was the most interesting opportunity or experience you had, and how did that impact your writing afterwards?
Yeah, did everybody hear that? That was such a gift that time. I didn't know what it would be. I knew what it looked like when other people were poets laureate. But I didn't understand. And I thought, okay, I'm going to be out there, hoofing it and reading poems all over the place. And this is a form of, as much as it's an immense honor, this is also a form of literary citizenship or service. But then I got to go into, and my project was to go to rural communities in parts of the country that don't always get visiting writers and don't always have book festivals. And I got to go into, like community centers and rehab facilities and detention centers and churches and talk with people about poetry and have these really deep, honest, powerful conversations about life through the poems that we read together. And it reminded me why I love poetry, not just for what it does for me as a writer, but as a reader, how poems can console you and offer you company in your loneliness, and how they can sort of speak to these moments in life that are impossible to fully capture on your own, and how a poem can give you the gift of remembering someone or some place that's gone, and seeing the way people who thought they didn't understand poetry became large and authoritative and wise, and because they were talking about the things poems brought back to them. It reminded me that's what this is for. This is a life-sustaining and community-sustaining art form. And I think that changed. I don't know how much it changed the way I write, although I think it has. I know it changed the way I teach. You know, I'm not as rigidly focused on the nuts and bolts of craft, even in my poetry workshops, because I understand that what we're actually trying to do is bigger than language. You know, you must have impeccable language and craft to do this big thing, but that can't be the sole content of our conversation. And so we talk about feelings and conflicts, and we talk about the world, and we talk about all these other things that are trying to find their way into poems. And that, I think, was an amazing recalibration. Not to mention how encouraging it was to go to all of these different parts of the country where politics and political maps tell me I don't belong, and to find so many sources of welcome and community. So that was also reassuring. And I don't think I could have felt that reassurance if I hadn't been, you know, going places, if I'd only been reading news or watching TV. Okay. So the question is about the really personal stuff that I write about in my memoir, or that writers are sometimes brought, you know, for whatever reason, to explore in what we understand to be the public forum of a book. Is that vulnerability where your best work comes from? I needed to write a story that told the truth, and I didn't know what my truth was until I went back and found ways of putting myself close to these formative experiences and observing what they held, and also maybe trying to be in dialogue with my young self by way of my adult self. It gave me a sense of the narrative continuity of my life, which had just felt kind of like higgledy-piggledy, herky-jerky, now I'm here, now I'm there, as I experienced it. And yeah, there's a lot of stuff that's really private. I was talking to myself in writing that book. It's like a conundrum, because as a writer, you know, with somebody with a book contract, you know this book is going to be on shelves. And yet, what brings me to the material is deeply private and requires like thorough examination. And so I wanted to be honest about, you know, my experience of loss, my experience of adolescence, you know, becoming comfortable with a body that feels like it's not your body, or, you know, big experiences like love or heartbreak, even conflict within a family, all these things that we usually hide from other people. I know how much I've been helped by reading about other people's experiences in books, even fictional experiences. Reading Jamaica Kincaid's novel Lucy gave me so much of a sense that I wasn't crazy for wanting to be different from my mother, for wanting to have a life and do things that I was told I wasn't supposed to do. And I felt like I wanted my book to be as free as the books that I loved, and as honest. I don't really think it's thank God, my job to judge whether it's my best writing, you know. But I definitely feel that all the material is valid material, you know, for any writer, and how you work within it and upon it. What your aim is You know, again, going back to, is it the ego? Or is it something bigger than your ego? Is it yourself, or is it maybe something collective? To me, that sort of is what tips the scale between yes or no. Do I say this or do I not? Okay, well, thank you all for your questions.
Thank you.
Let's give a huge round of applause. Tracy K. Smith, everybody. She just shared so much imagination, insight, wisdom, advice. I also want to thank all the questioners for sharing very meaningful questions. One last reminder before we go, there will be, you're welcome to join an optional Q&A period B. That's from 2 to 3 p.m. today in Tommaso. Have a great day, everybody. Thank you so